Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled ADHD in Communities of Color, Scrutinizing Barriers to Health Equity, Diagnosis, and Treatment. Leading today's presentation is Evelyn Polk Green, active in ADHD and mental health advocacy for almost 30 years. Evelyn has served as a leader representing the family and educator voices in the ADHD and mental health communities. She is a past president of ADA and CHAD, and she works as an administrator with the Chicago Public Schools. Evelyn joined us last month to talk about what educators should know about ADHD, and you can replay that webinar later at attitudemag.com/webinars. For today's webinar, we will cover practical strategies for achieving equitable ADHD care in BIPOC communities. Stigma, myths, and misconceptions about ADHD continue to impede diagnosis and treatment, as does cultural mistrust of the medical community and a shortage of clinicians of color who are knowledgeable about ADHD. Today, we'll talk about how, through education and outreach, this community can contribute to overcoming these barriers for better health outcomes. In recognition of ADHD Awareness Month, we would like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. If you could shine a light on any aspect of mental health equity or inequity in communities of color, what would it be? What does our society need to better understand to serve the health and well-being of people of color with ADHD? Please comment in the text box under the video player and tell us your thoughts. While you do, for answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, you can click on the FAQ tab on your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 474 to access the webinar resources, or simply click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine for yourself or to share with someone who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. You can also click the magazine tab on your screen to learn more. All right, so without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Evelyn Polk Green. Evelyn, thank you so much for joining us today and leading this really important discussion.
Thank you. Not a problem at all. I am very happy to be here, and this happens to be one of my favorite subjects to talk about. Much of that almost 30 years that I've spent in advocacy has been around marginalized communities, communities of color, poverty-stricken communities. So this is just a really important topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm glad it's starting to get some, attention from somebody besides me now, at least so. So today, just a quick overview. We're gonna the things that we're gonna talk about, and this is sort of a rough agenda, and know that we won't necessarily go exactly in this order because I too have ADHD and am bound to go off on a tangent at some point. But I need to start today with sort of the caveat that everything that I'm sharing today, all the information, is from my personal and lived experience as a mother of two children with ADHD, as an educator, and a Black woman with ADHD, and an advocate. So I'm going to share everything that I share is going to come from the lens of a Black woman that, has been an ADHD advocate for 30 years, because that's what I know. But a lot of what I say will be transferable to other communities of color. But the things that I'm going to say are going to be pretty specific to African Americans with ADHD. So And I'm going to start with a personal story that I hope is going to provide some context and perspective for everything we talk about today, as well as give some parameters around our discussion. And this is my story, my own lived experience as as a mom of a child with ADHD. And he was diagnosed at the age of 7, and at the time, his doctor, who was fantastic. We were very lucky to get somebody who knew and understood ADHD, and he encouraged me for a couple of years to start a chat chapter. And I was just like, I'm trying to figure out ADHD for myself now, and I'm not, ready for that. And I, just kept kind of turning around. So finally, after a couple of years, once I was more comfortable with the ideal of advocating, I told him, okay, let's do this. Let's open a chapter. And one of the reasons he wanted me to do it is because at the time there were no urban chapters. Almost every chapter, and I don't mean in the Chicago area, I mean around the country, there were no chapters, no local chapters in urban areas at all. And by urban areas, yes, I'm using the dog whistle. By urban areas, there were not chapters with, any, well, I shouldn't say any, but very, very many folks of color. And so I saw that and said, yeah, we need to do this. So in my efforts to do it, one of the things that we had to do back then, if you wanted to start a new chat chapter, was to talk to people that were in the area that already had chapters, because we didn't want to, you didn't want to feel like you were poaching from another chapter. And so we wanted to make sure they weren't too close and that the other chapter coordinator was going to be comfortable. So I called I lived on the south side of Chicago, and I called the local South Suburban chapter because there were only chapters in the suburbs. And so the response that I got when I talked to her and explained what I was going to do is the response I got from her was, well, I don't think you need to start a chapter in Chicago. She's like, that would be fine if there's something you really want to do. But she said, it's probably just a waste of your time. You should just come on out here because, kids in the city don't really have ADHD. They have behavioral and emotional disturbances. So that's how I began my advocacy career in ADHD. Needless to say, it took a couple more years before I got past that to actually open the chat chapter that we eventually opened in Chicago, which is, to my knowledge, the first really urban chapter that there was. And now I'm proud to say that there are many, many others. But at that point, we were the only one. And there were some things we did on purpose. But the reason I tell that story at all is to just give some historical context about how much things have changed, and we'll see more of this as I go through today, but how much things have changed in 30 years, but also how much they have not. There are a lot of places where things have not changed very much at all. So with that, let's go on and just very briefly, why do we even need to discuss this as a separate issue? And I've gotten this a few times. I've had people tell me, well, it's the same thing for especially if we're talking about kids, same thing for white children. They go through the same things, but not quite, as with most things. So we know that ADHD crosses all identity boundaries across gender, race, gender preference, socioeconomic levels, all of those things. It crosses all of those boundaries. And the prevalence is about the same across them. Now, it may not look like it simply because the difference in diagnosis and treatment rates, just the fact that the difference in rates of people even considering ADHD, but we know that the prevalence rate is about the same no matter what community you're talking about. One of the things that I know for sure is that representation matters. And here's just a quick example of why. I can remember not being very disappointed that when I went to look for information about treatment and specifically medication, when I looked at trials, there were no trials where African American kids had been included at one point, and then eventually there may be one or two, but there were not, even today there aren't very many. And so one of the things that I encourage parents to do, parents of Black children to do, is to get involved. If there's a trial that you can become a part of it, because it's important that we contribute to the knowledge base about treatment and for ADHD. And the only way we can do that is to become involved in the trials that tell us what treatments work. So that's just one quick reason why, one way I can say that representation matters. And then we need to address the unique challenges faced by our communities. Things like the criminal justice system and impulsive actions. And I'll talk about those more specifically a little bit later. Okay. So let's talk about barriers to diagnosis and treatment to start with. And I just want to say that there are both external and internal forces that contribute to stigma, that amplify stereotypes, and that stand as barriers to our diagnosis and treatment. And so some of those are, we talked about at the very beginning, the lack of clinicians of color, which is a huge one that I've been fighting for day one. I always tell people I was so fortunate that I was able to find for my kids, and also for myself once I was diagnosed, our psychiatrists who were African American and who got it, and I knew they got it. And in fact, one of them actually had ADHD herself. So the fact that this huge, disconnect with the number of clinicians of color, and we'll talk about why that's important in a bit, but also the fact that there are limited clinicians of any color in some communities. So let alone trying to find, a Black community clinician, or a Hispanic clinician, or Latinx clinician, finding somebody at all that knows ADHD and can treat it. And then, of course, there are societal stereotypes about mental health in general, and that's especially true in some communities of color. So those are some of the external forces that we talk about. But there are also internal forces, and I think that's what might make this a little bit different, is that we have went too far. We have these internal forces that affect that are barriers to our diagnosis and treatment. And one of the things that I always say is that ADHD definitely has a cultural component, and people don't always want to believe that, but it's true. It does. So here are some examples of what we have to think about. When I had to give my two boys, and we live in Chicago, grew up on the South Side. I'm sure, the whole world thinks Chicago is nothing but, a war zone. It's not necessarily, but it was, there were some things that I was concerned about, raising two Black children. And by the time they were teenagers, I was a single parent. So when it was time to have the talk, the teenage talk, because I'd had lots of talks before that. We all know, any Black parent knows we start those talks very early. But when it was time for me to have the talk with my sons, I had to talk to them not just about the kind of the usual and inherent things that African Americans have to talk to their children about, in terms of, you don't talk back to the police and this is how you behave and those kind of things. I also had to emphasize, you have ADHD, so you have to be very careful about how that you don't let your impulsivity get you in trouble. That we have to think about. We know that impulsive behaviors, we know that some of the research we've even done at ADA has told us how many people in criminal justice system probably have ADHD, most of them untreated, undiagnosed. And, it makes sense, because you do something impulsive that gets you in trouble. But so you have all those, it's like a double whammy. So there are certainly cultural aspects to ADHD, and there are other kind of things, like just my kids, there were certain ways they knew they had to act because they couldn't go out in public and have a meltdown. It just, because we were going to be looked at differently. And so um, there are things like what happens. There are also cultural perspectives when you think about how children are, and I'm not just talking about children today. I know a lot of things I've used the examples of children. I'm talking about adults as well, and we'll talk more about that. But how they're looked at for their behavior, and this falls into some of the reasons why parents don't want their kids evaluated and diagnosed or medicated. So we'll talk about those specifically in a little bit. But I just want to emphasize that there are very definitely cultural components and a cultural context to ADHD. The other thing is we don't talk about Bruno in our families. I think all of us of a certain age, and it's better now. I think it's much better now, but I think all of us of a certain age had that uncle that nobody ever talked about. That sometimes it might have been an aunt or uncle that was away somewhere, or they may have been in your home, but they never went out, and we never talked about those strange things that they did. And so that's another one of the barriers to diagnosis and treatment, just the fact that we don't talk about mental health. I'm thrilled that we have so many folks, celebrities, who are putting it out there, and so that they're making it okay. Taraji P. Henson comes immediately to mind. Who are making it okay, Jennifer Lewis, to talk about mental health. And so we're starting to talk about Bruno, but it has in the past definitely been a barrier, and to some extent still is. And then there's the historical trust of the medical community. And it's not just the medical community, it's also the educational community. So let's dig into that a little bit. We talk about resistance. You might hear that word. There's diagnosis and treatment resistance from communities of color around ADHD and other mental health issues. But it's not resistance. All of these things come from very real places of concern, things that there's a historical context for them. Is it resistance? What it really is reality. And it's where the fears originate. So we've got, the fear of medical maltreatment of maltreatment in both medical and educational sectors, parents' fear of labeling, of special education, of what happens at school to prison pipeline, parents' apprehensions about ADHD medication, practitioners' skepticism about things like the use of medication. Like I cannot tell you how many stories I've heard from mostly women with ADHD, adults who've recently been diagnosed, whose clinicians won't give them stimulants because they think they're just trying to, that they're a drug user, that they have a substance abuse disorder, and so no, they can't, or they're afraid that they will, and will say things like that to them. So that's a lack of cultural competence, but it makes a difference to where these things. So just, a quick history lesson. There's a reason that people have those feelings and are reluctant. We've got things like the historical mental health diagnosis of drapetomania, which for those of you who may not know, back during slavery, there was a psychiatrist who invented this diagnosis because he believed that any slave that ran away from their circumstances must have a mental health issue. Because why would you want to run away from being an enslaved person? So there's that. We've got things like the Henrietta Lacks issue, where they took all of her cells, and we're all alive and doing well because of those cells, and her family was just recently compensated for those. We've got the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. When you look at our education system in general, but specifically if you look at special ed, if you're a parent and you went to a public school and you saw your friends in the special classrooms that often were, met places like under the stairs or in a broom closet, they didn't even have real classrooms. That's not something you want for your child. And so the idea of having them labeled as such and being put in special ed, not understanding that it's not a placement, but if you don't know that, then that's would be your perception, especially if that's what you were used to. Um, so, they see people get in special education and never leave, and they don't want that for their child. They don't want their child to be labeled. They think that it contributes to the school to prison pipeline, which actually it does. When we put kids in programs where they're not getting the education they need to be able to succeed, then frustration. And that's when we do begin to get behaviors and see things that we don't necessarily want to see. So, there definitely is, these historical events have contributed to this mistrust and have shaped our current perceptions of what's happening. So let's talk about stigma a little bit. First of all, it's pervasive and it's difficult to combat. It's, been around forever. We all have these stigma. There's stigma around general mental health. There's stigma and stereotypes around, African Americans and other communities of color about our cultures and what we do and those kind of things. Again, we have both the internal and the external sources of stigma, just like we do to the barriers of diagnosis and treatment. And so there's that lack of understanding among professionals. And when I talk about the internal and external sources, I think I'm going to talk about it a little bit more as we go through. But I'm just thinking about when I say that, I mean, it's the external, the stereotypes that we feel, or the stigma that we feel externally, like we don't want people to feel. I know in my family, the kind of the attitude that was related to me was, we have enough stuff going on. We can't afford to be crazy too. So pull it together. You can't afford to be that way. So there's that. And so that's, well, I guess that's both an internal and an external force and source of stigma. But then, there are then there are things like, all the myths about ADHD, it's just bad behavior and those kind of things, bad parenting, whatever. My own mother, who was an educator for over 50 years, said to me when my son was first diagnosed, you just need to spank him a little more. Now, eventually she figured out that was not the case. So, but that was her initial reaction, which was not very surprising and very different. So we have to look at those internal and external sources that contribute to the stigma. And then there's the lack of understanding among professionals around ADHD in the Black community and how it may manifest and look different. A misunderstanding of behaviors often, and I have seen it with my own two eyes as an educator, the very same teacher, and that teacher might be Black or white. It happens it doesn't matter the race of the teacher, but they see a behavior from a white child and, attribute it to, oh, it's just boys being boys, or he's just having fun. The exact same behavior in a Black child is, I better watch that one. And yeah, we're going to have to do a behavior plan and he may need an evaluation. So it's not just a misunderstanding, it's implicit and explicit biases around behavior that happens. And then I'm going to say this as a Black parent. So there's huge challenges for parents of Black children with ADHD. You've got all the criticism from external communities, which we get anyway. There's a lot of pressure on Black children. Our kids need, especially I think when it's middle class families, there's an enormous pressure about education, and they have to do well, and you can't act up, and you have to be the perfect child, and you have to raise, not just be a perfect child, you have to raise perfect children. So there are those kind of external, and people are looking at us always waiting for them to mess up so they can say, yeah, that's, the way Black people behave. And so they're waiting, and you feel like folks are waiting. You get these external messages that we're just not good parents. So in addition to that, there's also the criticism we get within our own families. Like I said, my own mother telling me that, basically that I was a bad parent is what she was saying. So within our own families and communities, we get that if you just did whatever with that child, he wouldn't have that trouble. Or you're just letting them give that child medication and it's genocide. And so we've got all this criticism, both external and internal, as parents of Black children with ADHD. And if you're an adult, if you're a parent with ADHD on top of that, woo, it's a lot. Just going to say it's a lot. There are also challenges for adults with ADHD, the perceptions and the criticisms within our communities. I have a friend who talks about how, like, his own dad would talk about how, if you wanted to do better, you do better. We hear that all the time. I always say it's those same things that the teachers wrote on my report card before I knew I had ADHD. It's the same thing. It's the grown-up version of those same kind of things. So, you need to try harder. And if you want to do it, and you're, ADHD being equated with laziness and defiance, and it's a choice to behave that way. It's a reason why, your finances are a mess and you don't have good relationships and you're unemployed or underemployed. It's because that's a personal choice you've made. It's not because of how ADHD affects you. So, there's all those challenges. And then we have to look at the differences in care between people of color and the dominant culture. I've talked already about just being able to find clinicians, but then there's also the issue of suspicion around, are you just doing this to take drugs? Or, you want us to give you drugs? It's those kind of things, any kind of request for medication. And then let's talk about the wider implications of stigma, the effects of misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis. What happens? I always say, I am sure that our prisons and our juvenile justice facilities are filled with young men and women who have ADHD, but were never diagnosed or were misdiagnosed. And if they had only gotten treatment, it would have made a difference. I always tell people here, if you're slinging drugs on a corner, that means you have a business and you are a good business person. If you've been doing it for a while, that means that if you had the right things around you, the right people around you, if you had gotten the right education, you wouldn't have to do that. You would be doing something totally different. But you haven't, because you didn't feel welcome or as if you were understood in our educational system or even at home. So, we've got the risk factors that come around that. So, we get the risky behaviors of both, for children and adults, the risky sexual behaviors, what it cost us. You can look, I don't have the specific stats with me here, but you can look up and see all the things that happen with folks. Russ Barkley is a good place to look. All the dangers of untreated ADHD. So, more car accidents, more accidents, period, higher death rates, higher suicide rates. If you have ADHD and you're not on, a doctor supervised medication, it's very likely that substance abuse comes into play. So there are these, even because of the stigma around not wanting to admit or to be diagnosed, to get treatment, then we have all these wider implications that contribute again to some of the issues that we have in our communities. And then there are both the micro and macro consequences. Low self-esteem. ADHD children by the age, I think it's 8 or 9, have received almost, I think it's I don't know if it's in the millions, for sure in the hundreds of thousands of more negative messages from the adults around them than their neurotypical peers. What does that do to your self-esteem? What does that do to your internal self-talk? And that leads to loneliness and isolation because you don't want to be around. other people. We talked about the victim planning, and people are telling you you're making the choices, and so you're just being ostracized. So there's the emotional tolls, the individual struggles, but then there's broader social context, societal context to look at too. I've mentioned several times the school to prison pipeline. Um, Certainly ADHD contributes to that. That, kids get in trouble in school, then they drop out of school, and then they end up in prison because they're not in a supervised place where they're getting education and they're learning how to be a part of society. And so they're impulsive actions and they end up in prison. Economic challenges. We know that people with ADHD are unemployed and underemployed. So there are those consequences that impact our entire society. Wasted talent of folks, and then just the societal disconnect, the fact that folks are not active, productive members of society because of their ADHD. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. And again, that's not just something that happens in communities of color, but understand that it is amplified in our communities and multiplied in our community. So we have to, so I'm saying that to say that the effects of stigma and, untreated, undiagnosed ADHD, all those things, the effects of them are much more significant in communities and colors than they are in the dominant culture. So just real quick, just a word about cultural responsiveness and culturally responsive diagnosis and treatment. I have heard so many terrible, terrible, terrible things about experiences people have had with clinicians who, I'm sure that many of you have heard already some of like because we're hearing a lot of stories about how, doctors don't believe that African Americans have the same amount of pain that folks in the dominant culture do. And so, or the women who our maternal health rates are so bad in our communities because doctors don't believe women. I'm sure you've heard about Serena Williams and how she, with her first child, she had to say to the doctor, "I have an issue," and because they didn't believe her. And so she had to, really advocate and fight for herself. So it is vital that our clinicians, that we talk more about mental health in general, but specifically ADHD in all of our training programs, but that also culturally responsive treatment is a part of that training, that they get that information as well. It's vital that our clinicians understand the differences and understand that there are differences. And so how they speak to people, the questions they ask, the behaviors they may observe or ask about are going to be different. It's bad enough we really don't have a great diagnostic criteria for adults with ADHD anyway, but, then with adults of color, it's even worse. So I just wanted to stop and do that little commercial because it's a really important issue. So let's talk about, for our last few minutes, let's talk about improving outcomes. Community voices. It's so important that we speak out. I have always said the reason that I do this is not because I wanted to. I've not been doing this for 30 years, but I looked around and realized I was the only Black person talking about ADHD. And if I didn't do it, who was going to do it? So my poor children got dragged around with me. They had to do television interviews. We did conference presentations and keynotes and all kinds of things because that, in my mind, I didn't see anybody else of color, any other African Americans, Black families talking about ADHD and the impact we had. And I would not be sure that made a difference, but I have had friends tell me now, some of the influencers that are out there now say to me, the reason that we're doing what we do is because of what you did, and you paved the way for us. And so it's so important to speak out. The more people that we hear talking about it, the more we normalize it, and the more it's okay to talk about it, to get treatment, to share. We need to share our experiences with other folks. We need to have success stories of folks with ADHD and what happens with them, so everybody won't be so afraid. Um, we look at clinicians and treatment professionals. They have to have continued education on ADHD in diverse populations, the differences, that cultural responsiveness I was talking about. They've got to build trust and rapport with their patients. And we have to increase access, both having more clinicians and treatment, diagnosis and treatment centers in our communities, but also the number of BIPOC clinicians that are available will make a huge difference if we can increase that. So next, talking about educators. One of the things that I am just struck by, and I know this as an educator, and it was kind of reinforced for me this year in Attitudes Back to School issue, because it talked so much about how teachers do not get training in ADHD. Actually, they don't get training in special ed at all. If they're general educators, yeah, they get, maybe one class, and it's so generic, and it talks about every possible disability there is for, a semester or a half a semester. And that's it. That's all you get. Okay, well, given the prevalence of ADHD, you can guarantee that every educator is going to have at least one kid, and probably more, in their class with ADHD. So it's important that they get training on recognizing the symptoms, and not only that, recognizing those symptoms in diverse student populations. So is that kid that's out of his seat and dancing, is he that's the culture that he comes from, that's what his family dynamic is like, and so that's what's going on? Or is it ADHD? Let's look at it and think about it. And then they have to have strategies for inclusion and support of these kids, and they don't get that at all. Educators do not get that. I will speak up for my colleagues. We do not get that the way we need it. So there's a change going on. So I don't want to end. I've talked about a lot of negative things. I don't want to finish up talking about negative things. Let's talk about some of the positive things. There's definitely a change. We're changing the narrative. We're making a difference. I talked about the advocates and influencers that are out there now. If you go on any social media, you will see a world of information. Not all of it correct, but more importantly, you will see all kinds of folks talking about ADHD, and Black folks and other people of color talking about ADHD, where at one time we did not. There's definitely an evolution in BIPOC communities around ADHD. Some of the influencers, just right off the hand: Renee Brooks with Black Girl Lost Keys, Inger Shea with her entrepreneurs, women with ADHD, where she, has this group for entrepreneurs. Both of those, Renee's is a blog and some other things, and she also has a Facebook page, our unicorn page. Stacy Michelle, who has a YouTube channel called Black is the new, no, ADHD is the new Black. Sisters with ADHD on Instagram. And so that's, just to name a few. Of the folks that are out there now, this whole new generation of advocates, influencers, who are making people feel okay about their ADHD. They're normalizing ADHD through their voices. And then there are also the voices of other public figures who we're starting to see more and more, including those influencers. So that also normalizes ADHD, which is what we need to do. They're huge, their support through online groups and forums and things like that, the Facebook support groups I was talking about. There's also things like ADA, the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, has a specific virtual support group for African Americans and others from the diaspora. So there's that. And then initiatives from other organizations recognize the importance of addressing ADHD in BIPOC communities. I'm working with the National Academies of Science on a project, and one of the things that we're trying to do is to make sure that we are including those addressing ADHD in BIPOC communities in a lot of different ways. So there's another way. I want to talk about the importance of community. we're starting to, we need, first of all, and we're also starting to get these unique spaces to share and support and celebrate, because the truth is we need to have the support systems around us. We need folks that understand our perspectives and what we've got going on. And it's great to have allies and to be in a larger community, but it's also important for us to have our own unique spaces to share. Collaborative efforts are vital between community members and clinicians and educators. We need to be talking to each other and finding out how we can improve things and make things better. And we also have to have allies that add voices to the collective community that help folks understand what's happening, that who validate our experiences. And then I wanted to end with this for anybody who celebrates Kwanzaa or knows about Kwanzaa. One of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa is Ujima, and it is all about collective work and responsibility. And I don't usually read slides, but I'm going to read the meaning of Ujima, and it's to build and maintain our community together and make our community's problems our problems and to solve them together. And that is the only way that we're going to normalize ADHD in communities of color, that we're going to improve our outcomes, is if we do it together. And I'm happy to say that it's starting to happen, but it needs to happen even more. So I hope that you will all join me in that effort. And I don't believe it. I ended right on time.
Evelyn,
I don't know how I did that.
Thank you so much. Skill. Wonderful. Well, we did receive quite a few great questions. I wanted to actually start out. We began the presentation today by asking people if they could shine a light on any aspect of mental health equity or inequity in communities of color. What would it be? And we got some great responses. So I wanted to read a few of them. Okay. One here is that undiagnosed ADHD can manifest as aggression, and that when society sees a person of color exhibiting aggression, they should consider that ADHD or another neurodivergence could be the cause instead of jumping to other stigmas. We deserve as much benefit of the doubt as others.
Absolutely.
So well said, right?
Yes. Said much better than I did. That's one of the points I was trying to get across, but...
No, yours was also very well said, but sometimes our readers have the most amazing nuggets of wisdom. Yes. And it kind of sparked the question for me of, there's a lot of talk about the fact that our diagnostic criteria for ADHD is not accurate, that it really should include emotional dysregulation. And
absolutely.
Do you feel that there is a lot of talk that perhaps in the next DSM that it will be included? And do you feel like that will have a benefit in communities of color if people begin to understand that ADHD is heightened emotions?
Yes, I think it will. I mean, I didn't specifically talk about it in this presentation, but one of the things that I know I always have had to be careful about is being perceived as the angry Black woman. And I have a lot of emotional dysregulation. When things are not going my way, my frustration tolerance is not great. But I have to be so careful when I'm at work or out in public spaces about not coming off as the angry Black woman. And that's one of those things. So yes, if we can include that criteria as part, especially for adults, as part of the diagnostic criteria, that would be great. We also, though, need to talk about those cultural contexts and cultural differences in that diagnostic criteria, or at least caution folks to do what that listener said about, understanding that ADHD sometimes presents as aggression.
Yes. And I think that last part is missing from the conversation now. How ADHD may manifest differently in different populations based on culture and race. Are there any studies that you know of that have researched specifically how ADHD might express differently in people of color?
I think that those kind of studies are beginning to come out. What we have more so than those are the ones showing the results of what of like, rates of the intensity of, say, punishment or discipline among Black kids versus white kids with ADHD, those kind of things. I don't think yet, to my knowledge, that there are very many studies about how it does manifest differently. And other than, I mean, there are certainly some anecdotal things, and I've seen one or two where it's like hinted at, but I've not seen any definite studies. But that's one of the things that I would definitely encourage folks to look at and to study.
I mean, it's really amazing when you think about it. I mean, we know that adverse childhood experiences can cause trauma, that trauma impacts ADHD, but to not study how racism as an adverse child, life event, it's really staggering and just shows how much work
in many places we don't want to even talk about racism at all or acknowledge that it's a thing. So it does, but we certainly have to do that in our medical communities.
Mm-hmm. And you talked a bit about also the teacher training, which I know is your foray for sure. Do you have advice for parents specifically who want to raise this topic of uneven distribution of discipline based on ADHD symptoms presenting in the classroom? How can parents begin to have this conversation?
You know what? This is one that it's hard to ease into, because if you're seeing that, and it's not just because, teachers are often, like I said, sometimes it's the Black teachers as much as it is that's the studies show us, the education studies we have show us that the Black teachers are just as likely to exhibit implicit biases that result in more harsh discipline for Black kids than for white kids. So that is a very hard one, and I wish I had an answer, but I don't know other than to just say it, and you might need to say it with something like the studies that we're talking about, and to talk about, you realize that he has ADHD, and to just talk about how it manifests and how that may be what the issue is, and it's not. So the discipline needs to be adjusted accordingly. I know for me, raising my kids both in my household and then in school, the rule was education is, or not education, your ADHD is not an excuse for bad behavior. It may be an explanation why, it may be a mitigating factor into whatever discipline results, but it's not an excuse. But we still need to understand that it's there and to think about why and what we can do proactively to stop the behavior, because obviously something is triggering it. So what kind of things can we do to make our environment more inclusive for kids with ADHD and other neurodiverse students? So that is a hard one. I wish I could give you a straight up answer. Now, I will say this to you. If it gets very difficult, that's when you need to step up and go, like, if the teacher is not picking up what you're laying down when you try to say these things, then you need to just go ahead and escalate it up to the principal or whoever the next person up is on the chain, all the way to the school board, if that's where you have to go. And you also need to think about things. My own kid did not have, he was diagnosed at the age of 7, right at the beginning of second grade, I guess. And he did not get an IEP until he was in 5th grade, because in 5th grade, he had a teacher that was not willing to understand that he had ADHD, and these were the ways it manifests itself, and to work with us. Prior to that, all of his teachers were like, oh yeah, I've had kids with ADHD. What kind of things do you do? Yeah, let's try that and see if it works. So it was great. They were willing to, we worked together. But we ran up on this teacher who just was not having it. And so that's the point at which I had to get an IEP to protect him. And so that's my point, is that may be what you need to finally do, is to just get that evaluation and then get an IEP or a 504 plan so that your child has the protections that they need against harsh discipline or whatever it might be. And, having an IEP, getting special ed services does not mean that you're not with your typical peers. My kids both of them were in general education classroom. And in fact, both of them went to gifted programs in junior high and high school. They were always with their peers. They were never in a separate setting. And so it doesn't mean just because you're in special ed that you have to be in a separate setting if that's the concern for parents, which I know often it is, especially, like I said, those who experience not a great time in their own schooling.
Mm-hmm. I love that concept of I don't love it, but the way you express it, IEP as a form of protection for your child, not seeing it as a label,
right?
But as a way for you to protect your child from those teachers who may refuse to.
Right. And a way to ensure they get what they need to be successful.
Right. Right. And so this leads into another comment that we received in our poll, kind of along these lines. One of our listeners today wrote in, a lot of symptoms of ADHD are also stereotypes that have been assigned to people of color in a negative way. Due to the shame and stigma, people of color may not acknowledge or be comfortable letting others, even therapists, know of their struggle, even if they go to therapy. Really insightful. And you talked about this even at the end of your presentation about the importance of having safe places of your own to share. Are there any in particular that you can recommend for people to begin sharing their story?
Yes. Well, first of all, I know it's hard. So I'm not saying that if you don't do this, it's not okay. It takes a while. I mean, I wasn't running out, telling our business to the world immediately. It took some, I remember I was almost ill the first time that I did a presentation in front of a large group. Because I was like, yeah, you're telling everybody what's going on. And this, you're letting your skeletons out the closet. So it's not easy. So if you can start with groups that understand what you're saying. So I would say if for women and other folks, marginalized genders, there is the Facebook group, the Unicorn Squad. And if you just look up either Renee Brooks, Black Girl Lost Keys, or Unicorn Squad, that's one place to look. That is the most supportive community for women Black women of color that I have ever seen. So that's one place to start. Certainly ADA's a virtual support group is another place. It has brought so many people together, and again, just being in that safe space lets you talk. And so that's one. It's virtual, so I don't know if they use Zoom or what platform they use, but you're there talking to folks who share your experiences, and we have trained facilitators who are also people of color that run it. So that's another place to go. So those are two right off the bat. If you look, I'm sure there are like meetups out there, or start your own. We can't have too many of those safe spaces. So that's one answer, is to maybe consider starting your own.
Wonderful.
We probably need one. I haven't seen anything for parents, so that might be a place.
Yes. Yes. And I will say you mentioned a few resources during your presentation. We will do our best to gather those up and provide a list. So for those of you who are listening live or on replay, we'll do our best to list those out so that you can have easy access to a lot of these
Thank
great
you, because
resources.
You know what? Thanks. I meant to do a resource page, and I realized when we started that, you never did that resource page. So I'll send you what I have too, to make so you don't have to look for everything.
Oh, that would be wonderful. And if you have any books, a number of people today asked when you are writing your book, and they also wanted to know what other books you would recommend specifically for ADHD and communities of color.
You know what? There aren't any about communities
of
color and ADHD. There aren't any. There are books that I've relied on that have been helpful. Certainly, I can't think of the name of the book. I think it may be The Woman's Guide to ADHD. It's Sari Solden and Michelle Frank, Dr. Sari Solden and Michelle Frank. And they have a workbook that goes around it. And they are very cognizant, especially Michelle, of the differences for communities of color. And so they, I know that book is very sensitive to the kind of things that, we need to think about. I don't know about books. Renee Brooks, the Black Girl Lost Keys, again, she has a blog and she addresses a lot of issues that folks make issue. There aren't any, there really are not any books.
There you go. Well, I think you can hear what we're saying. Okay, another question. You talked a little bit about your personal experience with your mother and her reaction to the ADHD diagnosis. For those who are looking for good ways to explain to grandparents about ADHD in their children, anything that you particularly had success with or would suggest?
I'm going to tell you the book that I have given to friends and to family members that, or at least talked about passages from the book. And it's not a new book. It's a book that's been around for a while. Especially if you're talking about trying to explain. Well, no, it's a good explanation for adults too. Dr. Thomas Brown, ADHD. I can't remember the name of the book. It's the book with fish on the cover. Okay. I'll tell you that. So you look for it, but he explains it better than anybody else that I've ever heard. He has an explanation of, about executive functioning, about how it's a, conductor of an orchestra. And if the instruments don't have the conductor, they're just all out of sync and out of whack, and it doesn't make any sense. And it's just a lot of noise. You need the conductor, and that's what executive function is. And so he talks about the symptoms and what they are, and those in a way that is easily understandable for folks. One of the things that helped for me was I talked to my mom about, I was like, all right, I want you to just think about this a minute, about this person in our family who, okay, remember how they acted? Yeah, well, guess what? It's highly genetic. And so probably we had this person. So that's one way to relate to it, to do it. The other is, I need to say this, and not so much for grandparents, because grandparents, just because they're your grandchild, they tend to come around. It's usually other family members. One of the things that I just refused to do was to have my child around people who were going to not accept him for who and what he was, or what they were, who and what they were. And so there were family members that to this day, we don't have a relationship with, because they were not willing to accept and understand my decision as a parent of how I was going to deal with and treat their ADHD. So sometimes you have to do that, and we just need to, bite the bullet. It's hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but.
Mm-hmm. I will put in 2 small plugs for Attitude. We do have, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year.
Yes.
And so, yay. As part of that, we put together a list of 25 really important books about ADHD. And both of the books that you mentioned are on that list. So we'll include that list also in the resources.
Oh, cool. Very good.
But yes, the Thomas Brown one with the fish is a new understanding of ADHD in children and adults.
Can't believe I can remember it.
Yes. And in our winter issue, which is our anniversary issue, we do have an article all about navigating the holidays with relatives who haven't yet come to understand ADHD and or who refuse to understand ADHD. And
that's great.
Helpful advice in there. Yeah, it's good.
Of course, the classic are all, the book for all adults with ADHD, Ned Hollowell and John Rady. Okay, I'm having a complete brain freeze. I know you guys know it.
Driven to Distraction.
Yes, thank you. Driven to Distraction.
Well, I'm here for.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. That's another good one to for other people to understand, to give to a spouse or a partner.
The holidays are coming. Yes. Yeah. And you mentioned it, but ADHD is genetic. We had that question come up today. ADHD is genetic. We can't point to a specific gene, but it does run in families. So that introduces a whole nother host of challenges. Obviously, if a parent is is impacted by executive dysfunction. Yeah, I mean, it complicates the picture, and
absolutely,
yes, it's worth mentioning for sure. I will just I'll squeeze in one last question because we are almost out of time. But somebody wrote in to ask just your perspective on coaching as helpful for more for adults with ADHD.
I 100% endorse it. I actually was the one that kind of brought coaching into like CHAD, because before that it wasn't, we didn't have a lot of science about it. There is some science now, but there wasn't back then. But it was obviously adults were thriving who were using coaches. I love it. I don't have a coach currently. But in times in my life, I've had one for my kids. It's great for adults. It can also be great for kids, especially if they're in transition periods, the beginning of college, starting high school, making that transition. So they can be great for, teens and young adults and kids as well, but especially for adults. I thoroughly, endorse it. And what I am so excited about is there are more and more Black coaches. There were none when I started this. And there are more and more Renee coaches, Inger coaches. And in fact, Inger is starting an organization of Black coaches. There are so many now. And so I am just thrilled about that. And they're certified coaches so yes to coaches.
Yes. Okay, good. Adults. I'm glad we answered that. And I'm going to break my own rules, and I'm going to ask you one last question because I just saw this one and I think it's so interesting. Someone wrote in to ask, are there any efforts to educate the Black church? I have had parents associate behaviors with evil and they don't accept a mental health diagnosis.
So
this could be its own webinar, couldn't it? I'm sorry.
It could be. No, that's fine. No, I'm going to say that there are some, we have more progressive Black churches that you can go to. I will tell you, when I first started advocating, about that same time or soon after that, we joined a new church, and it's a very progressive church. And the first thing I did was go to the youth minister and talk to him about ADHD and what they might be seeing like in Sunday school and how it was a thing. And they were willing to accept it because we also had a mental health ministry in that church and a prison ministry in that church. So they, it wasn't such a hard thing for them. Other churches, it may not be as easy to get on, but I would start that way. Maybe go through your youth minister. If there are educators at the church that may have a clue, because yes, the Black church should be in on it. And I think in some places it is, but at this point it's very, I think, individual efforts, sort of like what I did and what other people are doing.
Yes. Thank you so much, Evelyn. It's always such a pleasure to speak with you. And we so appreciate your contributions to the ADHD community and to Attitude. So thank you very much for being here today with us.
I'm very welcome. I was delighted. And what a way to start off ADHD Awareness Month. Yay.
Indeed. A wonderful kickoff. And thank you to everyone who joined us as well. We hope that you will come for more webinars in the future. To keep up with all of our upcoming webinars, articles, research updates, you can sign up at attitudemag.com/newsletters, and you will never miss a thing. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 474 to access the webinar resources, or simply click on the episode description wherever you stream your podcasts. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine for yourself or to share with someone who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. So for now, thank you again, Evelyn. Thanks for joining us, and happy ADHD Awareness Month, everyone.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
Get more from your internet with Vibe. From more speed for streaming movies and online gaming to more Wi-Fi coverage for all your devices, Vibe gives you more with the fiber-rich internet you need. Get fiber-rich internet with speeds up to 105 megabits per second for only $29.99 a month for the first 12 months. Sign up today at vibebroadband.com and discover why Vibe means more. Offer ends July 2nd, 2023. Not available in all areas. Modem, certain installations, taxes, and fees extra. Subject to data plan. Visit vibebroadband.com for all restrictions.